Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Omnipod. Simplify life with diabetes. By Inhaled Insulin Glucose Management in the Moment. And by Dexcom. Help make knowledge your superpower with the Dexcom G6 Continuous Glucose Monitoring System.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, Jeff Ryan has lived with type 1 for more than 50 years, but he also has what's called an essential tremor. Part of the treatment for that included using powerful magnets, which made thinking about diabetes tech a little different for Jeff.
The magnets were powerful enough. They're about 3/4 of an inch thick and roughly 2 inches square. I could hold one in the palm of my hand, and the second one would stick to the other side of my hand. I wanted to make sure before I got an insulin pump that if I accidentally moved that magnet somewhere close to it, I didn't just completely screw up the electronics on it.
There is a lot more to that story and a lot more to Jeff. He talks about being diagnosed as a toddler in 1971 and how treatment for both his tremor and his type 1 have changed, as well as the power of community for both conditions. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome back to another week of the show. I'm your host, Stacey Sims, and you know we aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. This episode is going live the very first week of August 2022. And just quick housekeeping note, there will be no In the News episode this week. At least I'm not planning on it. If there's something bananas big that happens, I will definitely throw an episode on there if I can. I am out of town this week visiting my parents, catching up with family. Leah is with me. Benny is still at camp. He comes home later this week, but the adventures continue. I will tell you more after the interview. Here's the tease. He's coming home with a cast. Yeah. All right, more about Benny a little bit later on. Never a dull moment. But my guest this week has a pretty unique story, not just about diabetes. There's a lot of unique there, too. Jeff Ryan was diagnosed as a toddler back in 1971. He also lives with an essential tremor, which is a neurological or nervous system disorder. But he had deep brain stimulation surgery, DBS, to control that in 1998. And a connection from that surgery led him to try an insulin pump. And there's a Medtronic connection through both health conditions. Jeff kind of became the poster boy for the DBS procedure, especially because he was so young. There's a lot of video, there are news stories, and I will link those up and post them in the Diabetes Connections Facebook group as well. Jeff recently received his 50-year Joslin Medal, and getting the paperwork he needed for that helped him solve another fun little mystery around his diagnosis. Why do the hospital photos show him in front of a Christmas tree in October? And it wasn't because they put him up early. Back then, you know, they did not put the Christmas trees up in October. All right, so Jeff is coming up in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Afrezza. And since starting this podcast, one of the highest interest topics has been Afrezza inhalable insulin. I am so excited to partner with them to tell you more. Afrezza is an ultra rapid-acting mealtime insulin. You breathe it in using an oral inhaler. Once inhaled, Afrezza passes quickly through your lungs and enters your bloodstream in less than a minute and may start reducing blood sugars within about 12 minutes. Find out more. See if Afrezza is right for you. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Afrezza logo. Afrezza can cause serious side effects, including sudden lung problems and low potassium, and is not for patients with chronic lung disease such as asthma or COPD, or for patients allergic to insulin. Tell your doctor if you ever smoked, have ever had kidney or liver problems, a history of lung cancer, or if you are pregnant or breastfeeding. Most common side effects are low blood sugar, cough, and sore throat. Severe low blood sugar can be fatal. Do not replace long-acting insulin with Afrezza. Afrezza is not for use to treat diabetic ketoacidosis. Please see full prescribing information, including boxed warning, medication guide, and instructions for use on Afrezza.com/safety. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me. I understand that as we are speaking, you have received your Joslin Medal.
I did.
And the story behind kind of how you got that medal is one of the things I want to talk about today. But thanks for jumping on and sharing your story. I'm not quite sure where to begin. There's so much to tell here, but 50 years with type 1 last year. Tell me a little bit about, do you remember any of your diagnosis? I know you know the story, but do you remember any of it?
I was 3 years old at the time, and what I remember was we'd been to the doctor in town. And when we came home that night or that afternoon, we were having dinner, and Mom and Dad sent me over on the stairs to eat while they were talking kind of back and forth between themselves, something that they didn't want me to hear. And the only part I heard was, well, how long is he going to be there? And so at some point then they said, well, you're gonna take a trip here for a while, and we're going to go to La Crosse. And so I had no idea where that was or what the deal was. My biggest concern was I didn't know how Dad was going to get any work done while I wasn't around.
Were you and your dad's away all the time at home?
Yeah, I was. We milked cows at that time, so I was down in the barn with him whenever I could be.
Did your dad go with you? Did both parents take you to La Crosse?
I don't even remember. I think they both were, because we went to Cresco and they basically said, we need to get this kid up there right away. When I checked in La Crosse, my blood glucose was 660.
And as we're speaking about La Crosse, we're talking about La Crosse, Wisconsin, and this is a medical center that's there.
Yeah.
When we think back to that time in 1971, I imagine there was no home blood meter. This was some kind of lab equipment that they used in the hospital.
More than likely, because after that, the only thing I used was test tape for urine samples for 10 years at least. I don't think I got a monitor for blood glucose until I was in college sometime in the late 80s.
It's amazing to think about how much it's changed, because so many people listening to that are thinking now, so how do you live? How do you grow up? How do you go to kindergarten, right? How do you milk the cows if you don't know what your blood sugar is? So tell us about what it was like.
We always had a nice schedule for milking cows because it was exactly the same time every day. So meals were always on time at exactly the same time every day. The work schedule was relatively uniform throughout the year, throughout the day, as far as that went. And from what I remember going there, the doctor that I saw said, we know what to do with sugar. We don't know what to do with any of the substitutes that they're using currently, saccharin or any of the other ones. So don't completely eliminate sugar from this boy's diet. Make use of it. We know that he's going to be physically active, so that may be a big plus for you. Just try to lead as normal a life as you can, but try to limit intake wherever possible.
That's interesting. I've heard from a few other people, it's certainly not a scientific method, who grew up on farms and who grew up with, a lot of just, that homemade food and don't limit sugar, just, eat healthfully. And it seems to have made a difference for a lot of people.
I think it did. And I don't really remember going to the doctor a lot of the time. It wasn't like they were micromanaging me. So they put a lot of faith in both my mom and my dad to take care of it. Dad usually gave me the shots for the first, I suppose, 8 or 9 years. And then I think I started doing my own at about 12, maybe 13, somewhere in there. And so
what kind
it was
of shots? Tell us about the shots.
I was the last customer at the pharmacy in my hometown to use beef and pork insulin. Probably close to 30 years, I think. The last one, I got an insulin pump in March of 2001. And so I switched at that time. I don't even remember what we used the first time, if we went straight to a Humalog product, but they said, these are the last bottles we are going to be able to get. You're the only customer that's using them. And so when I went to visit that endocrinologist, he started quizzing me about, do you do exchanges? Do you count carbs? Do you have a scale? And I thought, well, this is probably not the time to tell him that I quit seeing a doctor for my diabetes in about 1978 or so. And we were much just self-care from that point forward. This is one of those situations where don't do as I did, just follow it. And so oddly enough, my A1C was around 6.2, 6.4, no problem there. And so the guy started asking questions about, do you count carbs? Do you do exchanges? And I said, no. And he said, well, how many grams of carbs do you eat a day? And I thought, oh boy, I have no idea if I should guess a single digit number, three-digit number. I'm not entirely sure. And he said, well, do you do exchanges? And I said, no. And he said, well, what do you do? And I said, I just eat. I just eat like normal. And if I can feel when it's getting high, then I take a little bit more regular insulin. If it's getting low, I eat some carbs. I don't measure anything.
Did you stay on a schedule all those years? By 2000, 2001, were you still like, okay, the cows are milked at this time, I'm eating at this time? Did you still have that in your head?
For the most part, yeah. We always try to eat at about the same time every day. I don't know that the diet really changed that much. And it was always physical activity too. So there's plenty of exercise. We're working outside, we're loading hay, we're moving corn, we're doing you name it for physical activity.
Were you still doing that in 2000?
Yeah. It's the only job I've ever had. Things have changed slightly, but it's the only thing I've ever known.
You mentioned your A1C was in a terrific range. What prompted you to see the doctor to get that insulin pump in 2001?
The other health condition I've had for probably most of my life is essential tremor. And so I discovered a device that they implant for essential tremor where they drill a couple holes in your skull and put electrodes into the center of your brain, hook it to a pacemaker that sends a signal out to basically override the tremors. And so a health reporter from a TV station about an hour south of me did a story about my surgery and the condition. And she's also diabetic. And so she mentioned a month or two after it aired, hey, there's going to be a meeting on insulin pumps here in town. I thought maybe you might want to go to that. And so I showed up and listened to probably, I don't know if they had 4 different manufacturers there. And so I went to talk to one of them. And at that time, the device that controls my tremors was activated, turned on and off by a really powerful magnet. The magnets were powerful enough. They're about, 3/4 of an inch thick and roughly 2 inches square. I could hold one in the palm of my hand and the second one would stick to the other side of my hand. I wanted to make sure before I got an insulin pump that if I accidentally moved that magnet somewhere close to it, I didn't just completely screw up the electronics on it. So I talked to the mini-med rep and I said, okay, here's a question you probably don't get real often. Problems with magnets with this. And he said, well, what are we talking about? And I pulled out the magnet and he says, oh, he noticed that it said Medtronic on the back. He said, come back here behind the booth for a second. I want to talk to you. And so we went behind his booth and he said, just so you know, Medtronic owns about 30% of Minimed. And this would have been in 2001. I said, okay, that's all I need to know then, because the other device has been just great for me. So I let if they have some interest in that company, then I'll probably just go with the Medtronic insulin pump. And so that's how I stumbled upon insulin pumps. I had no interest, no knowledge of it ahead of time. And just because Heather, the reporter, told me about it, that's how I got there.
So I can assume by the fact that we're talking, you're in good health. I assume you stayed on the insulin pump, that the magnets worked out okay.
Yeah, it was no problem for that. In fact, that doctor retired probably, I don't know if it would have been 3 years later. And so I went to a different facility. They weren't going to get a replacement in for him before I needed my prescription refilled for supplies. So I went to a different doctor and he started asking questions. And he said, well, who's been taking care of your diabetes? And I said, oh, this guy that retired. And he said, okay, but you've only had a pump for a couple of years. Who took care of it before that? And I said, well, there was really nobody there for about 20 or 25 years, I guess. And
you took care of it.
Yeah, he just had a fit at that point. And so every question from that point on for the rest of the 20 questions or so that he asked, whenever he would ask me one of those questions and I give him an answer, he'd just shake his head. Oh, Mr. Ryan. My A1C was 6.2. How much better would I have been if I'd have gone to an appointment with you every 3 months for the last 20 years?
It's so unique, though, especially now. And I don't really know what it was like, in the 70s, 80s, even the 90s for most people. It's not a question I've thought to ask of the people I've talked to is, how often did you see the doctor? But, of course, now they want to see us every quarter. And by us, me and my son, that they want to see people with diabetes a couple of times a year at least, right? Right back to Jeff answering my question. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Omnipod. Omnipod technology is constantly advancing. You deserve to have the latest and greatest when you want it. Nobody wants to be locked into a contract. At Omnipod, they heard this. And this is why they have the Omnipod Promise. For users getting product through the pharmacy, the Omnipod Promise allows new and existing users to start on Omnipod Dash with no contract, commitment, or obligation. And then you can upgrade to Omnipod 5 at no additional cost. And remember, this is regardless of your existing contract when covered by insurance. You'll get a free controller/PDM with your first box of pods. Don't wait. Start on Omnipod Dash today and be ready for the latest and greatest with the Omnipod Promise. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Omnipod logo. For full safety risk information and Omnipod Promise terms and conditions, visit omnipod.com/diabetesconnections. Now back to Jeff talking about how often he actually had to go see an endo.
Well, and on the farm, we got a semi to haul grain about 10 years ago. And so at that time, it was probably, I think, 2007, maybe when diabetics could finally get a CDL to drive a semi. And so you were required to go see an endocrinologist. You couldn't go see the diabetes educator. You couldn't see anybody else. They had to have certain classifications to be able to sign the paperwork for you. And so at that point, the one that I was seeing, I'd seen a diabetes nurse, at that point, a diabetes educator, and she said, hey, I trust you. You're not going to be a problem on the road, but I don't have the letters after my name that they want signed on that sheet, so you're going to have to go find somebody else, somebody that was probably about 3 hours away. And it was kind of a nuisance to have to do that every 3 months. And when I went in and he looked at the numbers and said, I don't see how I'm going to tell you to do anything different. You're getting the exact results that we'd like you to get. So keep doing what you're doing. Okay, thanks for coming in. And it was about minutes or so that I was in there. And so every 3 months, I would get in the car and drive 170 miles and see him for about 5 minutes and say, everything looks good. Any questions, any concerns? Okay, see you again in 3 months.
Was there any equipment you were not allowed to operate before that because of diabetes?
No, diabetes didn't really have any limiting factors for me. And the other thing was, early on, I discovered that we could keep what I call thermoneutral carbs, all the vehicles, tractor cabs, pickups, you name it, something like Brock's orange slices, Smarties, things that don't freeze and turn to concrete in the winter and don't melt and turn to pudding. Yes, you can have some, but never take the last serving because those are for Jeff in case he needs them.
Oh, yeah.
Consoles on tricycles and vehicles either have Smarties or wintergreen lozenges, something like that can last forever.
Those orange slices, my son loves those. They don't freeze. We live in the South, so I don't know.
They'll get a little bit, you got to work at it, get them in December, January sometime.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the tremor that you had. Is that gone because of the surgery? Is that something that you will have to have the rest of your life?
It's always going to be there. So the device basically controls your tremor. It doesn't get rid of the underlying condition. Now, the best part of this is that I can turn it off at night. I don't have tremors when I sleep. Sometimes Parkinson's patients will have them either 24 hours a day or they last long enough at night that it's kind of a problem for some people to sleep. And I've never really had that problem. The doctor said at the time when we did it, we don't know if turning it off at night is going to extend battery life considerably. You would think 8 hours of sleep, you should get at least a third more time out of it. She said it's really not going to make that much difference. But because of your age, and I was 30 when I got it, she said, just from a long-term standpoint, I think maybe it'd be a good idea to shut it off at night, just so you don't have 24-hour stimulation, kind of like building up a tolerance to it. And the other part that's unusual about the surgery is that you are awake while they're doing this.
Oh, boy.
So you are lying on the table while they take a drill, and the doctor that did my surgery used a hand crank drill and not a high-speed dental drill. So you have this guy huffing and puffing right above your head. And so they drill a hole in your skull, and then it's about, I don't know, the size of a nickel or a quarter, something like that. And then they take the electrode and put the electrode down into about the center of the brain for essential tremor. And so when that electrode is placed in the right position, they do some testing with it. So you'll be holding onto a cup. A ceramic cup with a metal spoon works the best because you can hear it right away. And so when you're in surgery, you're shaking like mad. They give you a cup, and the doctor would hold up her finger, go to her nose, and say, okay, now touch my finger. And as they move the electrode around, all of a sudden, bang, you're just perfectly steady.
You got an award for helping people with essential tremor get through this kind of surgery.
The only way that I found out about this device was because the patient who got the first one in Iowa as part of the research trial had a story both in the Des Moines Register on the front page and then on a couple of TV stations also that same day. So because he shared that and they had his name, they had the doctor's names, I contacted the doctor and said, can I get in for this appointment to learn about this device? And they said, well, you can't make the appointment yourself. You have to see a neurologist to be referred to us. And I thought, well, great. The neurologist that I see, I had asked about the device and that doctor was not in favor of it. He said, no, that's for patients with really bad tremors. Yours aren't that bad. You don't need to even think about this. And so there is a bike ride that goes across the state of Iowa every summer. There's about 10 to 15,000 bicyclists that ride on it. We had a group of them that stayed here with us in 1996. One of those was a small town physician in southwest Iowa, just about in the opposite corner of the state from where I am. And I got a hold of him and I said, how do I go about making this appointment to see this person without stepping on toes here? And the other neurologist that I saw upset. And he said, oh, well, if that's the doctor you want to see, she has a satellite clinic. She comes here every 2 weeks. I can get you in to see her. That's no problem. By the way, I didn't know you had this condition. How bad could it be? And I said, well, I'm really good at hiding it. So most people didn't know I had it.
Let me ask you about that then, because I'm picturing, right, that you are, you mentioned Parkinson's, that you are shaking all the time, that it is really, giving you a poorer quality of life. Tell me about what it was like and why you wanted the surgery.
When I talked to that farmer, he was, I think at the time, 74 or so. And he started going down the list of things that he couldn't do anymore in his life. He said, I can't write a check to anybody because your hands can barely control it enough to get the numbers and the letters written down. I can't work with tools because you can't get wrenches onto bolts. I can't do, and he went down the list of everything that he couldn't do. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is me right now. And that guy is, 40 years older than me. And this is what I have to look forward to. And so I said, would you do it again? He said, absolutely. No question. I said, it worked great. I love it. I love what they did.
Well, I know we're supposed to be talking about diabetes, but I appreciate you sharing so much. I mean, it's so interesting, and it's something that, you could see it would really give you issues, especially as you mentioned, trying to fill the syringes, trying to do injections. I mean, it had to have been very, very difficult. But you got through the surgery, and then you were helping other people. So tell me about that. How do you help? I mean, do you just tell people what it's like? Are there ways to really, I got to tell you, drilling holes in your skull, it's very scary sounding.
That's actually what helped some of the patients. When they saw it and said, we get to physically see what takes place and what the outcome is. Because the company can send you a videotape, a promotional videotape, whatever it is. And they said everybody on there, first of all, looks like they're on Medicare. And you're 30 years old versus somebody that's 75 or so that's in the video. And they don't really go into surgery on the promotional videos. And so they said with yours, for the first one in 1998, they came out to the farm and watched me do a few activities. Then we sat and talked about it and some of the things I did at the time to keep it hidden and people's reaction when they see it. I stayed in touch with that reporter. This would be the diabetic one who got me an insulin pump because I kind of owe her one. And so when it was time, that would have been about Christmas time of 1999, I said my neurologist called and I have been approved for a second device for the other side. Each side of your brain controls the opposite side. So if it's your left hand that shakes, you'll get the device put in the right-hand side of your brain. So she said at that time, FDA had not approved bilateral implants for both sides. You could only do one at a time, and you had to get special clearance to get a second one. So she said, we've talked to FDA, we've talked to insurance, and we've cleared it. So if it's okay with you, we can do it. And I said, that'd be great. And I talked to Heather, and I said, hey, we're going to go ahead with surgery. And she said, you know what? That story was so impressive and so much fun. See if your doctors will let us bring cameras into the operating room. And so I thought, well, okay, I guess we can ask, worst case scenario, they say no, but what if they say yes? And they said yes. And so they brought cameras in and talked to me ahead of time, the whole prep as we were going through the procedure. And then I think it was around 5:30 when we got there that morning. You go into surgery around 7:30. And so they had Heather and the cameraman were in there and took all kinds of video. And then you see the procedure as it's going, as they put the electrode in and get to the right spot. And all of a sudden, that hand is perfectly steady. And it's fun to watch.
How do you help others get through it? Do you show them your procedure? Is it more like the community support that we see a lot in diabetes?
I've done everything from support group meetings for essential tremor. I've done a couple of Parkinson's meetings, but typically Parkinson's is different than essential tremor. They go to a slightly different area of the brain. The side effects and other things that those patients deal with are not quite the same. But a lot of the time, that would have been 1998 through probably 2003 were some of the last stories that I did. We were still using a format called VHS for you kids out there. So I had 2 VCRs at home, and I would make copies of the tapes constantly. And one of those early ones, I've been to Medtronic headquarters a couple times in Minneapolis, and so I got to know one of the people up there, and she's a media services specialist. And so there was one patient that I talked to, and I said, well, what kind of problems do you have with it? He said, it's really a nuisance at work. And I said, oh, okay, well, what do you do for a living? And he said, I work at an explosives factory.
Oh,
yeah, I could see where there's a problem there. And he said, well, it's not like spilling your orange juice at breakfast, Jeff. He said, if you spill it, the hazmat team comes in. And if I drop it, you're going to hear about it on CNN. So he said, this is a major problem. We talked about it, and I said, based on where you live, if you don't have a doctor lined up, here's a couple suggestions for you. And so he got surgery lined up. And what I always found worked the best was to call the patient in the hospital that night, because most of the hospitals will let you talk to them. If you know their name at the front desk, that's about all it takes to get through. And so when you're the patient sitting there in your room after that surgery, the nurses don't understand what happened. Your family doesn't totally understand what happened. And it's kind of fun to talk to somebody who does know what that means.
Yeah. So you have a unique in at Medtronic. Do you still use a Medtronic pump?
Technically, I do. It's a 523 because I'm running loop. But because of the way that other device worked, my insulin pump has always been kind of an afterthought at Medtronic.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's so interesting, though. So what happens next with the essential tremor? Does the device stay in forever? Do you have another surgery? How are you doing?
We've done, we did a revision. I had a staph infection in 2009, 11 years after I'd had it implanted. And so at that time, we put a PICC line in and did antibiotic therapy. And the best thing to do is to remove the entire hardware system, pull the electrodes out, and let it stay out for 60 days, and then reimplant it again. And so my original surgeon by that point had retired, and so I went to a different one. And he took everything out, and I was home for 2 months or so of back to shaking every day, doing everything, and then went back and got that one side reinstalled. And then when it was time for a battery replacement, I've been running usually somewhere around 3 to 4 years on a battery. I did not go with rechargeable one the last time. And so we're going to put in a new battery. And I said, I'm getting a tingling on the other side. And when I talked to them at the appointment, they said, well, kind of based on the way it sounds, it's probably not in a perfect position. So what we're hoping we can do is we'll take that electrode out and just put in a different one. And so when we got done with surgery, he said, well, we tried to remove the old one, but it didn't really want to come. So we just put the extra one in next to it, relatively close. So somebody made a mistake on the files, and I had access to the files at one point for all my x-rays. So I have some really cool looking x-rays that I can share with people that show all of these weird looking wires curving around in my head.
It's always amazing to me to talk to somebody with your perspective. 50 years living with diabetes. Obviously, other issues have come up in your life as well, some of which probably took precedent over diabetes at many times. When you look back and you think about how isolated you guys were when you first were diagnosed to what it is today, what comes to mind?
I think about it, if I had been diagnosed within the last year, within the last 3 years versus 50 years ago, look at the resources that are available to you. I knew that doctor up there, and he was endocrinology. Your local physicians didn't really know that much about it. I don't know that they would know a significantly greater amount now. They'd have some familiarity with it. But that combination of internet access and I think the ability to just feel free to talk to anybody. It doesn't have to be another patient. You can ask doctors. You can ask specialists. You can talk to people at the company. You can talk to whoever you want to get those questions answered. Just imagine trying to write that many letters and wait around for all those responses to come back 50 years ago.
Jeez.
And to find the people to write to begin with.
I want to go back to the very beginning with you. If you don't mind, can you share the story that you shared with me about the Christmas card? Because you were diagnosed in October, but there's this photo of you with a Christmas tree.
October 11th, 1971 was the day that I was admitted to La Crosse. And so I was up there, I believe, for 10 to 14 days, something like that. And at that time, they were building a new wing in the hospital. So as a farm kid, I got to watch equipment running outside my window all the time. So it wasn't that bad. I was stuck in a room. And one day they came in and they said, we need you to come down. We're going to have a project here. We're going to work on something. And so I went down the hall with them, and there was a Christmas tree in this, lobby area. And 3 nurses were there. And so we all stood by this Christmas tree and took a bunch of pictures. And I thought, maybe these people from Wisconsin do things differently, but we always had snow on the ground when we had Christmas in Iowa last year, from what I remembered. I don't know why they're doing it now when we haven't even harvested corn yet. And so I thought nothing of it, and we went back to the room, and I thought, okay, that was strange, but whatever. And then come to find out later on, that was the photo that they used for their newsletter and fundraising letter that they sent out for the holidays. Here is a picture of poor, innocent little Jeff at the hospital. If you make a donation, you can make his time here more enjoyable. And so when I filled out the application for Joslin, they said, we need copies of your diagnosis signed by the doctor. If your doctor is present, we can get him to do it. And I thought, well, he's long gone, so that's not an option. And so I called the records department. When I signed up for my 25-year medal 10 or 15 years ago, they didn't need the exact date. They didn't need copies of the paperwork, anything like that. And so the lady that I talked to at that time said, well, I can tell you it was October of 1971. I can't tell you what days. And I thought, okay, well, that's all I need to know. Just would have been nice to get it. I got a hold of him again, and I said, this time I need hard copies, and I need the doctor's signature and proof of lab work that was done, everything else. And so the person that was doing it, whose last name was also Ryan, we're not related, said, yeah, I can get that for you. And it wasn't too long. She sent me a link, and I said, oh, that was great. You did that in no time flat. Here's a long shot for you. I was taken down to this room and had my picture taken in front of a Christmas tree. Is there any way you could find that for me? And it didn't take her long at all. And she sent me another email and said, this is the one you're looking for, I believe.
Wow.
I said, exactly what I wanted.
Did you actually send that to Joslin?
I think I did put a copy in, yeah.
Jeff, it's funny to keep hearing October of 71. I mean, that's my birth month. I'm not too far behind you in terms of age here. But we're very young. We're very young. And you have a lot of time ahead of you, knock wood.
The other thing I remember as a kid, when Dad would get done milking at night, he'd come in, he'd usually lay down on the floor because his back would be bothering him. And so I'd lay down next to him or on him, and we'd watch the news or whatever was on. And there was a story on the news one night, and the reporter was talking to some little girl who was about my age, that was probably 8 or so at the time. And the reporter said, well, what do you think your life will be like when you're my age? And he said, I'm 40. And she said, oh, I'll be dead by then. Very matter-of-factly. And the guy said, well, recent studies have shown she's probably right. Because diabetes on average, and he quoted whatever study it was and the data. And I looked at Dad and I thought, 40? I'm dead by 40? And I said, this is Walter Cronkite's guy, so I know it's accurate. And he didn't know what to say. He was just sitting there thinking, oh, man, what do I tell him now? So for most of my life, I've just figured I don't have much longer.
Well, okay. Now, I didn't even know, right, where you were going to go with that story. So the girl in the news, they were doing a story about diabetes?
Yeah, they were doing a story about this recent study that they'd had. And they said, so we talked to a youngster. She's 8 years old, and she's had diabetes a while. And so the reporter said, what do you think your life will be like when you're my age? And I'm 40. And she said, oh, I'll be dead by then.
Unbelievable. But not, because so many people were told that. So I will reframe my question. I was going to ask you about looking ahead in terms of technology and that kind of thing. But when you think about kind of what you've been through, to be wearing a DIY insulin pump now system, right? And looking ahead,
right.
Knock on wood, tell Walter Cronkite, sorry, you were wrong about this one this time. What do you think about now for the next, hopefully, I'm very superstitious, so I'm not going to ask the question that way. But, Walter Cronkite, you were wrong this time. It's amazing to think about.
And so much has changed in the last 5 years even compared to 10. I don't even know what to predict, what to guess for 10 years from now. We look at what changes there have been in CGMs. Those things have come 2009, I think, when I got my first one. And I remember going to the shareholders meeting at Medtronic that summer, and I'd gotten it probably 2 or 3 months ahead of time. And so I had my A1C taken a week or two before that meeting, and I talked to the director of medicine and technology at Medtronic that day, and he said, how do you like the CGM? And I said, well, it works great. And he said, performing decently? And I said, yeah, I was 5.9 on my A1C a couple weeks ago. And he said, wow, I don't know if mine is that low, and I'm not diabetic.
Exactly. Well, Jeff, please keep in touch. I'd love to know more about the studies you're going to take part in, how the Joslin medalist studies are, and the other things that you're taking part in. Thank you so much for sharing your story, and I hope we connect again soon. Thank you.
It'd be fun. I appreciate it, Stacey.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
Lots more information about Jeff. There are news stories and lots of write-ups about his surgery and about his experience with type 1. All of that is at diabetes-connections.com at the episode homepage. Every episode has its own homepage, so you can see the links, and it's just a little bit easier. I like to mention it every episode for new people. It's easier sometimes than the podcast apps, which are great for playing the episodes, but they're not great sometimes for all of the links. And if you're curious about the essential tremor, Jeff is so open about this. He actually recorded, when we talked after the interview, we recorded some audio about what happens when he turns the stimulation off. But there is actually better video of that. It didn't come out that great. Sorry, Jeff, audio-wise. On my end, that's probably my error. but I think you can really hear it and see it very well in some of the videos. And huge thanks, kudos to you, Jeff, for being so open about all of this. And boy, he sent me a bunch of photos. So I've put everything I can into the Diabetes Connections Facebook group. I think that's the best way to see it. All right, coming up next, I got to tell you about Benny. Yeah, he broke his insulin pump a couple of weeks ago at camp. Now he broke something else. Oh boy. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. Dexcom has a diabetes management software called Clarity. Do you use this? Because for a long time, longer than I'd like to admit, I thought it was something that just our endo would use, but it's really helpful. You can use it on desktop, you can use it on your phone as an app, and it's an easy way to keep track of the big picture. We will be using this when Benny gets home from camp. I haven't seen any of his numbers since sometime in June when he left, and Clarity will be much better to look at what's been happening over these last 8 weeks than just looking at the Dexcom Share and Follow apps. Clarity can help you see longer-term trends. The overlay reports can help put context to it. And when you share the reports with your care team, it's easy for them to get a great idea of what's going on and how they can better help. Managing diabetes is not easy, but I feel like we have one of the best CGM systems working for us. Find out more at diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Okay, so what happened here? I will start by saying I realize now as I'm sharing this story, I did not ask Benny about his numbers or about diabetes management through any of this. And I only say that because I'm realizing this as I'm relaying the story to you. I find it interesting. I don't know if it's good or bad. It's just what is right now with our family. But I am also realizing that I was not worried about his blood sugar numbers, which is kind of an interesting sensation. Okay, so here's what happened. As you're listening, it'll be almost 2 weeks now. This is one of those things I just did not want to share right away until we learned more about what was going on. I got a call from the nurse and Benny, the same kind of call I got when he broke his insulin pump or really just shattered the screen on it. And if you didn't hear that story, he's fine. He had a replacement with him. But they FaceTimed me and they were in good spirits. You know, those of you who have heard Benny on the show before, he's a pretty easygoing kid. And this nurse has been absolutely fabulous, just so helpful and shares his sense of humor. So long story short, he had hurt his hand very badly. He said he was in no pain. She said it was very swollen. So they took him to urgent care. They needed my permission to bring him kind of off campus, right off camp, to go to the urgent care. They went. The urgent care nurse did a bunch of x-rays, and she said that she thought he would need surgery. So we prepared to bring him home. We mentally prepared to bring him home because we all agreed that we would get a consult the next morning. There's an excellent medical staff at the camp where he goes. This is not a diabetes camp if you're not familiar, but they are great. So they had contacts in Atlanta. The camp is in Georgia. They consulted with a hand surgeon in Atlanta who looked at the x-rays and said, nope, does not need surgery. But because where the break was, I first thought it was a finger, but it was actually a little bit lower down in his hand. He did need a cast. So they took him to Atlanta that day and they got him a cast that, to my eye, looks like it goes up to his elbow. Oh my goodness. But in the usual Benny way, he was texting me saying he was excited that he got to eat at Varsity in Atlanta. He was much more concerned about that than getting this cast on. So I knew it couldn't be that bad. And he was back at camp that night. He did call me later on that night, but I'm going to let him decide how much to share about that story. I'm definitely interviewing him when he comes home. I'm assuming he'll be happy to share all these stories. He called me because he had a minor diabetes frustration that evening at camp. And as you can imagine, especially those of you who live with type 1, when things are happening one right after the other, you just need your diabetes to behave itself, right? And for Benny, that was really the straw that broke the camel's back, and he needed to vent to me. It was nothing serious. It was nothing he hadn't handled a million times before, and he did it very well. But boy, did he need to vent. And I'm so grateful. I'm so lucky that he called and vented to me. And by the time we were finished, of course, he was laughing again. Didn't want me to worry. But he needed to acknowledge that diabetes wasn't playing fair at that point, and he'd had a really bad couple of days with his hand. So I know you all can relate to when you've just got to say, this sucks. The next photo I saw of Benny, which was, I'm pretty sure, the next day, the cast was full of signatures. He was smiling, and he seems to be doing just fine. I'm assuming he's getting lots of help at the medical center for his diabetes stuff, like filling the cartridge and putting infusion sets on and stuff that he would normally do and need both hands to do. But he'll tell us all when he gets home. I cannot wait to see that kid. All right, as I said earlier, there is no Diabetes Connections in the news this week. I'm probably going to post a little bit on social media, but we are on our last vacation of the summer, and then it's home and shopping and packing and getting everybody ready for school again and saying goodbye to my daughter and finishing the book. I actually finished all the edits this week, so now we're in the design edit parts. I cannot wait to get Still the World's Worst Diabetes Mom out to you all, but that'll be a couple of weeks. All right, thank you to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I will see you back here soon. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.